Parents always want the best for their children, even if it seems that parents are talking real nonsense. Sometimes it's still worth listening to them. My father sent me a note accusing my wife of cheating. I didn't believe him at first, and very wrongly. A fairly ordinary man sat quietly at the edge of the party. He had brown hair and hazel eyes, but nothing particularly stood out about him. Dressed in a three-piece suit, he was focused on his tablet, sitting apart from the main activities. The event was a combined wedding rehearsal dinner and dance for two couples, Gary Harris and Belinda Cummings. Gary stood about 6'1", weighing around 200 pounds, with wavy blonde hair, blue eyes, and a friendly smile. Belinda was approximately 5'8", with short, curly brown hair, striking gray eyes, and a well-proportioned figure. Her bust size was likely between 36C and 38C. The other couple was Jason Witten and Melissa Foster. Jason was just shy of 6 feet tall, often joking that his goal had always been to reach 6 feet. His slightly long dark brown hair gave him a rugged appearance, while his eyes shifted between dark brown and black, depending on the light. Melissa, at 5'5", had long auburn hair that cascaded halfway down her back. Though her bust was smaller than Belinda's, her body proportions were equally stunning. Both women were undeniably beautiful, and both men were considered quite attractive, with everyone agreeing that they made ideal couples. Gary and Jason had been close friends since their first day of elementary school, whereas Belinda and Melissa had only met during their junior year of college. Despite their relatively shorter friendship, the two women had grown very close. Gary moved around the room mingling with guests. While he knew most people, there were some unfamiliar faces, and he made an effort to introduce himself before the food was served. Eventually, Gary noticed the man sitting alone with his tablet and approached him. Sitting down beside him, Gary smiled and extended his hand. "Hi, I'm Gary Harris, one of the grooms." The man extended his hand to Gary and shook it. "I'm Preston Fulton, though most people just call me Prez." "Which bride, or is it the other groom that you're here for?" Gary asked with a broader smile. "Actually, I'm here for both you and Jason," the man replied, then added, "But I'd like to speak with you first, and afterward, if you're willing, I'd like to speak with both you and Jason together." Gary found the request rather strange and wanted more information before agreeing. "You seem to know more than I do at this point," Gary said, feeling uneasy. "What exactly do you need to discuss with me, and why would you need to talk to both Jason and me?" Press reached into his pocket and produced an envelope. "I think this letter will clarify most of my intentions. If after reading it, you decide not to continue, I'll just speak with Jason alone." Gary tore open the envelope and began reading. The fact that it was from his father alone was shocking enough, but it was the letter's contents that completely shattered his world. "Dear son, it saddens me to send Mr. Fulton to deliver this message. To put it bluntly, Belinda has been unfaithful to you, and Mr. Fulton holds the evidence. After you've seen it, I urge you to follow his advice. I've enlisted his firm because they offer much more than just proof of your fiancé's betrayal. Please listen to Mr. Fulton carefully and trust what he tells you. Your mother and I love you, and I am deeply sorry that you've been hurt in this way. If, once this unfortunate situation is behind you, you need someone to talk to, I'll always be here for you. Love, Dad." Gary read the letter over and over, unable to believe its contents. He loved Belinda with everything he had. She was everything he'd ever wanted in a wife. Beautiful, smart, charming, and loving. How could she cheat on him? His father must be mistaken. Maybe the letter was forged, but the signature was unmistakable. Gary couldn't wrap his mind around the accusation against his future wife. "I don't believe what my father is saying," Gary muttered, his anger rising. "If it were true, he would have told me face to face." "Allow me to properly introduce myself," Press said, pulling out a business card from his wallet. Gary took it and read it. All it said was, "Me Inc." in the center and in the bottom corner. Preston Fulton, Field Representative. The card made no sense, and Gary didn't bother to hide his confusion or suspicion. "What the hell is Me Inc.?" Gary asked. "It stands for Men's Equality Incorporated," Mr. Fulton replied matter-of-factly. "What the hell is that?" Gary was now visibly angry. Over the last few decades, the women's liberation movement has been incredibly successful in taking away men's rights. Our organization is committed to restoring equality between the sexes. As things stand, the National Organization for Women has done significant damage to young men, especially boys. "What? I've never heard anything like that," Gary challenged. "And what does that have to do with Belinda cheating on me?" "As for your fiancé's cheating, nothing directly, except she feels justified in doing it because of the toxic rhetoric from Now," Press answered calmly. "But our group exists to fight against the unfair laws currently in place and to protect young men and boys from the hostility directed at them by these women's organizations." Press paused for a moment, studying Gary. Satisfied that the young man was still following, and not entirely lost in thoughts of his fiancée, Press continued. "For example, most elementary school teachers are women, and research consistently shows that these women tend to give boys lower grades than girls. A boy can go through his entire school life without ever hearing anything positive about being male. We're literally raising generation after generation of weak men. More young men are choosing to live with their parents after college, and fewer are even attending college. Among those who do, even fewer pursue fields in science and technology. Me Inc. is here to change that." Gary's mind was nearing a breakdown. Just 10 minutes ago, he had been the happiest man alive. Now he was on the edge of losing control. He had to know if the rumors about Belinda were true. All right, that all might be true, but where's the proof of Belinda's infidelity? "Gary," Press placed his hand on the young man's arm, "before I show you the evidence, I want you to remember your father's advice. Please listen carefully to what I'm about to suggest and follow my instructions. After you see the videos, your instinct will be to confront your fiancé right away. Naturally, you'll want to lash out at everyone involved. But if you do that, you'll lose the chance for maximum revenge. And I want to be clear. This isn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. What I'm suggesting will send a powerful message about cheating. So, can I trust you to stay calm?" Gary felt his heart race and his palms sweat, but he finally nodded. "Whether or not you decide to confront your fiancé tonight, I still want to talk to you and Jason. While that conversation won't fix this situation, it will help protect both of you in the future." Gary nodded again. Satisfied, Mr. Fulton clicked on the playback icon on the screen and handed the tablet to Gary. A few moments later, Gary saw a video of Belinda cheating on him with a stranger. There was no time or date on the video, so Gary ignored it. Before his engagement to Belinda, he dated several women and did not hold a grudge against her for her past. However, the following video infuriated him. Belinda was there with her ex-boyfriend, and this one had a date, 2 days after they agreed on exclusivity. He remembered this moment because they committed themselves on New Year's Day, and the video was shot on January 3rd. Despite this, Gary believed that if this was a one-time event to end a previous relationship, he could leave everything as it is. But the next 3 videos left no room for doubt. In the 6 months they were engaged, Belinda slept with many men, some of whom were even his friends. The last video almost made Gary lose his temper, almost making him lose his temper during the rehearsal dinner. It showed Belinda and Gary's best man, Spencer Tolliver, together in Gary's apartment. But it was the audio recording that almost made Gary explode with rage. "Belinda, you're an amazing woman," Spencer said. "I think these little affairs will stop when you get married." "No way," Belinda laughed. "I love Gary very much, but I also like your skills. I'll make sure that we can meet again." "I really feel a little guilty for doing this," Spencer chuckled, patting her on the shoulder. "But I'd be crazy if I didn't do it." Press watched as Gary looked like he was about to throw up. The operative pulled a small bottle out of his pocket, opened it, and waved it in front of Gary's nose. He then handed him a bottle of water, which he picked up from the ground at his feet. "Are you feeling better?" Mr. Fulton asked. "Your reaction is quite normal for a person who was caught off guard. I'll explain in a minute how we plan to deal with this, but take comfort in the fact that you will find out about Belinda now, and not in 10 years, perhaps with the participation of children." Once Gary had managed to pull himself together, Press asked him to call Jason over. Press suggested that Gary should inform his friend about Belinda. It would be better for Jason to know before the ceremony the next day. Press also mentioned that Jason wasn't dealing with the same issue, but they both needed to hear what he had to say, as it was crucial for their futures. It took a few minutes for Gary to separate Jason from his fiancée. Eventually, Gary insisted, saying there was someone Jason needed to meet. While heading over, Gary leaned in and whispered something to Jason. Jason stopped abruptly and said, "No way." But Gary assured him it was true. The introductions were a bit uncomfortable, and at first, Jason didn't want to stay. He only agreed after Gary explained in more detail what he'd just found out about Belinda. Initially, like Gary, Jason didn't believe it. But instead of showing him the video, Mr. Fulton presented 3 photos that left no doubt about Belinda's betrayal. Once both men were settled, Press set up his tablet to record their conversation. He then provided a detailed explanation of the organization he worked for. Later, Press planned to review his presentation to ensure he hadn't missed anything, and would send a copy to headquarters for their feedback. Every interview was evaluated, as ME Inc. continually sought ways to improve its organization, protect its members, and communicate its message more effectively. Press once again expressed his apologies to Gary for the trouble his fiancée had caused. He handed him a package containing a detailed list of instructions for the upcoming ceremony. Press also gave each young man a book outlining the mission of ME Inc., detailing the challenges the organization faced and their strategies to address them. Additionally, the book provided recommendations for married men, reinforcing the advice Mr. Fulton had previously shared with them. He further explained that their fathers had already paid for their lifetime memberships. Mr. Fulton stayed a few extra minutes to make sure Gary didn't lose his temper with his fiancée. He nodded in approval when Gary told Belinda that his stomach was bothering him and that he would be going to his parents' house as planned. This arrangement was based on the old superstition that the groom shouldn't see the bride before the wedding. Mr. Fulton also approved when Gary gave Belinda only a brief kiss on the cheek before leaving. If Belinda suspected anything, she didn't show it. She danced and drank for the rest of the evening. Some of her dances raised a few eyebrows, but people were lenient, given that it was the night before her wedding. After retrieving his coat from the cloakroom, Prez headed out. He still had another meeting scheduled for the evening, and needed to be at the church the next day to observe Gary's wedding. He also had a meeting the following day, but after that he would finally be able to return home to his family. Wrapping his scarf snugly around his neck and slipping on his winter coat, Prez stepped out into the frigid Ohio night. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees, but the biting wind made it feel even colder. Snowflakes swirled in the air, and the overcast sky hinted at an impending snowstorm. Prez was already looking forward to returning to the warmth of sunny South Florida. He merged onto Route 20, heading toward East Cleveland. At this late hour, traffic was sparse, making it easy to navigate to the Cleveland Clinic's main campus. The vast medical complex spanned several city blocks, but locating the right building brought him a sense of relief. The mostly empty parking lot, a sharp contrast to the usual daytime struggle for spaces, made parking a breeze. Once inside, Press checked in at the front desk. His superiors had provided him with the credentials necessary for hassle-free access. After a few minor detours through the building's winding hallways, he arrived at the cafeteria, ready to face his next task. Fortunately, the bulk of the work had already been handled back at the office. Only a few final steps remained to be completed on site. Press pulled a photograph from his pocket and scanned the room. He soon spotted Ben Sharpen sitting alone at a table along the far wall. Ben, at 49 years old, looked much older. Standing about 5'10" and weighing close to 240 pounds, his appearance reflected years of wear. His hair, mostly gray, with traces of brown, added to his aged look. With slumped shoulders and a pallid complexion, he seemed like a man who hadn't smiled in a long time. "Mr. Sharpen, I'm Preston Fulton." Press introduced himself. "Feel free to call me President. I work for a company called ME Inc. We're here to help people like you." The man stood and shook hands. "Nice to meet you, but like I said on the phone, there's nothing you can tell me about my ex-wife Connie that would surprise me. And I'm pretty sure there's nothing you can do to help me. Honestly, I couldn't care less what Connie does or who she does it with. As for my kids, they're not worth the trouble. I think I have some information that you'll find interesting, but before we get to that, why don't you tell me about your marriage and divorce?" "There's not much to tell," Ben shrugged. "It was a crappy marriage. Connie and I got married right out of high school. The first 2 years were good. I thought we really loved each other. But things started to change when she got a job at that brokerage firm. Her attitude shifted, and I was thinking about divorce. Then she got pregnant, and I was stuck. She eventually got fired, we moved, and things improved for about a year. But once she started working at a law firm, everything went downhill again. She got pregnant again and quit. With 2 kids and a wife, like Connie, it wasn't great, but I stayed for the kids. I kept thinking about divorce, but then she announced she was pregnant again. What a waste of my life." Mr. Sharpen shook his head, took a sip from his coffee mug, and sighed. "We were married for about 12 years. Then I caught her with the UPS guy in our bed. I filed for divorce right away. Stupid me didn't hire an expensive lawyer like she did, and of course I had to pay for hers since Connie wasn't working. In the last few years of our marriage, I barely got anything from Connie, but the courts sure screwed me over." "Tell me about the final divorce settlement," Prees asked. I had just become head of the X-ray department and was finally making decent money. After the judge was done with me, I was left with about what I made when I first started working. Connie got the house, and I had to pay the mortgage and property taxes. On top of that, I'm paying her alimony and child support for each kid. What really burns me is that I'm funding Connie's lifestyle, so she can stay at home and screw her lovers. I'm sure they're all laughing at me. So you can see why I don't care about what Connie's doing anymore. I've talked to a bunch of lawyers, and they all say there's nothing I can do about it. Your case is one of the most glaring injustices I've seen recently," Prees said sympathetically. "I believe action needs to be taken to fix this situation." I appreciate the thought, but I only have 2 more child support payments to make, and then I'm free of those awful kids. Connie turned them against me from the very beginning. If any of them were on fire, I wouldn't even cross the street to help. As for Connie, if she were on fire, I would cross the street, but only to pour gasoline on her. So, I don't see much I can do now, but thanks for caring. You're one of the few who's ever taken my side. I understand why you feel stuck, Press replied, placing his briefcase on the table and opening it. But there are several things you don't know that will change everything. Like what? Ben asked, now a bit intrigued. To start with, Mr. Sharpen, none of those 3 kids are yours, Press said as he laid DNA test results on the table. That cheating witch! Ben shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The cafeteria went silent as people looked our way, but soon everyone resumed their meals. Press noticed Ben shrinking into himself again. In a quieter tone, Ben said, "Even so, it's not much of a relief. I'm almost done paying child support. At least I don't have to feel guilty for hating them." "No, Mr. Sharpen, your relief is just beginning," Press replied with a smile. "Let me explain. You might not even have to make those last 2 payments. We know who the real fathers are. 2 work at a law firm and 1 at a brokerage. All 3 are married and partners in their firms. We've already filed lawsuits against them to recover all the child support you've paid. They'll have to reimburse you tens of thousands of dollars. And their wives? They'll be informed of their infidelity. Whether they'll divorce them or not, who knows, but there's a good chance they will." Ben sat there, stunned. "Is this really happening?" "Absolutely, and there's more. We're going to right all the wrongs done to you." "Why are you doing this for me?" Ben asked, worry etched on his face. "I can't afford to pay you anything. I'm barely scraping by." "Don't worry, Ben," Prees reassured him. "This is being done at no cost to you. The company I work for is dedicated to fighting injustices against men. It's time true equality existed for both men and women." "Wow, I had no idea there was an organization like that," Ben remarked. "But how do you fund everything you do?" "We use the interest from our capital fund," Press explained simply. "We're always recruiting new members. New members pay a one-time initiation fee of $1,000, followed by an annual fee of $250. They also pledge to offer their expertise if it's useful. A lifetime membership costs $100,000. All the money collected goes into the capital fund, and we use the interest to finance our initiatives. Currently, our capital fund is approaching $2 billion. We also have several large benefactors who help fund our lobbying efforts and generously contribute to our capital fund. "But I haven't paid anything," Ben objected. "And like I said, I don't have any extra cash." "Relax, Ben. This isn't going to cost you a cent. Around 20 to 30 times a year, we take on pro bono cases. Yours is one of those. ME Inc. is covering all your expenses." "I don't know how to thank you," Ben said gratefully. "I haven't finished telling you everything we're doing for you, but if you want to thank us, live a good life." Ben just nodded and smiled for the first time that evening. "Now let me continue," Press resumed. "Your ex-wife hasn't been honest with the court. She has a source of income, but it's illegal. She sells prohibited substances. In fact, she was dealing while you were still married. She's been stashing money overseas, but we tracked it down and emptied her accounts. She'll find out tomorrow that all her money is gone. But that's just the first bit of bad news for her. We've arranged for the police to raid your old house. Connie recently escalated her operation and has enough prohibited substances to qualify as a major supplier. Not only that, but we believe there's enough evidence to connect her to the death of a teenager from prohibited substances she sold him. We expect her to get at least 15 years in prison. All 3 of her kids will also be indicted, and they'll face significant jail time too. Oh, and her last 4 lovers will go down with her. Connie will be an old woman by the time she ever sees the outside of a cell. Ben's eyes widened in disbelief as he tried to process everything he was hearing. Now here's the most important part. The brokerage firm and law firm where the men worked who got your wife pregnant, they're being sued for allowing their partners to exploit you and your wife. We expect them to quietly pay you a 7-figure settlement each. When that money comes through, you can, if you like, purchase a lifetime membership with ME Inc. But since you're a pro bono case, it's not required. A grin spread across Ben's face from ear to ear. I'm not sure if any of this is true, but just thinking about it has lifted my spirits. And if the money comes in like you say, I'll definitely be signing up for a lifetime membership. After Ben signed a few papers, Prez headed back to his hotel room, eager for a good night's sleep before the wedding the next day. The following morning, the snowstorm that had been predicted never came, and the sun was shining brightly. Prez was sure the bride would be pleased with that. Though the temperature stayed in the mid-20s, the lack of wind made the cold quite bearable. The wedding was scheduled for 1:30 in the afternoon, so Prez took his time, spending about an hour reading the newspaper. When he finished, he crumpled it up and tossed it to the floor. One of the things he'd learned during his training was how to spot media bias. That morning's paper had no fewer than 5 articles supporting women's viewpoints or condemning crimes allegedly committed by men. It wasn't that Prez thought the men in the stories were innocent. That didn't bother him. What irked him was how these stories were prominently featured on the front page, giving them more attention than they might deserve. He'd noticed this bias across newspapers, magazines, movies, TV news, and shows. By 1:15, Press was sitting in the back row of the church on the groom's side. Once seated, he looked around for the videographer. When he didn't spot him, Press got up to search. If the person responsible for recording the ceremony wasn't there, Prez would have to use his handheld camera, which he wasn't keen on since the quality wouldn't be nearly as good. Finally, up in the balcony, Prez found the videographer setting up by the railing. After wandering up to check the view, he saw that the man had picked a perfect spot to capture the event. With nothing else to do, Prez returned to his seat. At exactly 1:30 p.m., the organist, who was playing several pieces, suddenly stopped and played the wedding march. Gary, his best man, and the groom's friends have already taken their places at the altar. The bride began to slowly move down the aisle, accompanied by her father. About 10 minutes before the start of the ceremony, 2 white screens silently lowered, turning to face the audience. When the bride and groom finally stood side by side at the altar, the priest began the service. Today is a blessed day when a man and a woman tie the sacred knot of marriage. This marks the beginning of their journey together, where they will love, support, and help each other grow beyond what they could do alone. Gary Lewis Harris, do you take Belinda Marie Cummings as your lawful wife, so that from this day on, in sickness and in health, in wealth and poverty, forget about everyone else until death do you part? Gary was silent, staring at Belinda for several long moments. The parishioners began to whisper, noticing that he was late with the answer. Then, turning to face the guests, Gary loudly declared, "No, I will not marry this lying woman." He pressed a button on the remote control, and images of Belinda immediately appeared on the screens. Chaos ensued, Belinda and her mother screamed, and some of the guests hurriedly left the church. The president watched Spencer's face turn pale. Then Gary walked over to Spencer. Gary, I dot dot dot. Spencer muttered, but he never finished because Gary hit him with his right hand. Spencer was thrown back. At that moment, Belinda had collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably while her mother tried to console her. Belinda's father stood over them, his face flushed with anger. He kept glancing between the screen and his daughter, his expression filled with utter disgust. Finally he growled, "Belinda, don't come back to our house." As this scene unfolded, the groomsmen, all except Jason, began to stir but weren't sure how to react. Jason stepped in front of them, raising his hand. "That thing on the floor's trash," Jason said with intimidating authority. "If any of you want to defend him, you're no friends of Gary's or mine." The groomsmen exchanged looks, then glanced at the screen. They all shook their heads, and one said, "I want nothing to do with that jerk. What a piece of trash." Jason then approached Spencer, who had collapsed, and helped him sit up. "Listen, Spencer," Jason said loudly, his voice filled with disgust. "You know you're a worthless piece of trash, and now everyone here knows it too. We've been friends our whole lives, and this is what you do? You were supposed to be Gary's best friend, and on top of that, you're an assistant district attorney. How do you think your boss will react when a copy of this lands on his desk on Monday? And the copy going to the Bar Association? That's going to cause you a lot of headaches. So why don't you do everyone a favor and get out of here? Oh, and delete our phone numbers." Spencer awkwardly scooted away from Jason, stood up, and slipped out through a door at the back of the church. Meanwhile, Gary retrieved the package Mr. Fulton had given him the night before, which he had hidden behind a column near the altar. He started pulling out photos of Belinda with different men and began handing them out. His groomsmen got the first copies. Then Gary approached Belinda and her mother. "Here are some pictures to help you remember this special day," Gary said, dropping a stack in Belinda's lap. She looked up at him in despair. "I'm so sorry, Gary. I really do love you," she whispered. Gary shook his head and grinned. "Let me clarify the situation. Are you showing your love for me by sleeping with Spencer? You're really great, Belinda. You need serious help, but it's not my problem anymore. Good luck with your miserable life." "Please, Gary, give me another chance," she called after him. Without turning around, he replied, "No way." Gary walked down the aisle, throwing photos on the benches. His father caught up with him and put his hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Gary, it's time to go. This is a paid appointment. We might as well have a snack." Looking at his father's sad smile, Gary replied, "Give me a minute, Dad. I still need to make sure that someone gets these photos." Gary went straight to the elderly, gray-haired man, Belinda's boss, the owner of the financial planning firm where she had worked for the past 2 years. "Mr. Turner, I'm Gary Harris. You may not remember me, but we met briefly at your company's Christmas party." "I remember you, Gary," Mr. Turner replied, standing up and extending his hand to help his wife. "I deeply regret everything that happened." "I just wanted to give you some of this," Gary said, holding out some photos. "That's not necessary, Gary. I've already seen enough." "Oh, this is not for you, Mr. Turner," Gary said, handing the photos to Mrs. Turner. "The Turner. This is for your wife. You and Belinda are in these photos. She's sprawled out on your desk and you're having a great time. I hope you enjoy it, Mrs. Turner." Turning to his father, Gary said, "I'm ready to go now, Dad." Prez smiled as he jotted down the details of the exchange. After confirming with the videographer about where to send the tape, he returned to his hotel room. He had a report to write and needed to review the video of his conversation with Gary and Jason. The report was straightforward. Prez went through it twice to make sure he hadn't left anything out, and that there were no spelling errors. Then he pulled out his tablet to watch his discussion with Gary and Jason, keeping a checklist beside him to mark off each point as he covered it. He began by outlining the mission statement of ME, Inc., which was simple: to ensure equal legal treatment for men and to support ME, Inc. members who were being wronged by their partners, whether women or men. Prez listened as he explained how men are often treated unfairly under current divorce laws, almost like second-class citizens. Even when both parents are equally good caregivers, the courts tend to grant primary custody to the mother. Additionally, if the wife hadn't been working, alimony was almost always awarded. Me, Inc. didn't oppose alimony in general, but objected to unlimited alimony, which fortunately wasn't allowed in many states. At some point, the woman should be required to find a job, sooner rather than later. Me, Inc. also suggested an alternative to the typical custody arrangement where one parent has limited visitation rights. Their proposal involved a plan where parents would switch living arrangements every 2 weeks, allowing the children to stay in one place while both parents got significantly more time with them. Press believed the next part was crucial for men who were in relationships, but not married. He stressed, as forcefully as he could, that they should always use some form of contraception. He cautioned against believing a woman who claimed she was on the pill or unable to conceive. Prez devoted considerable time to this issue because if a man wasn't cautious, there was a risk of the woman he was with becoming pregnant. The feminist movement had promoted the idea that women had total control over whether to have a child, which effectively gave them complete reproductive control, potentially disadvantaging men. Although Me, Inc. did not oppose women choosing to have and termination of pregnancy, they did object to the situation where women, if they decided to keep the child despite the man's objections, did not take financial responsibility. While women had the right to terminate a pregnancy, men had no say if she chose to keep the child. Courts would typically mandate that the man pay child support, which Me, Inc. viewed as a gross injustice. The ringing phone in the room startled Press and worried him. He rarely received calls when out in the field. He always called his wife each night, so if she was calling, it likely meant an emergency. Occasionally, the office might call. Pressing pause on his tablet, Prez answered the phone. "Hello?" "Turner, something's come up," Prez boss James Baker said. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to extend your stay for another day." "Oh, what's the issue?" "We have another project scheduled the day after in Akron, and the field representative assigned to it is out with the flu. Everything is set up. You just need to be there to record it. Ensure you film the entire meeting, not just the audio. The usual bonus for the extra day has been approved and will be included in your next paycheck. My camera is charging right now, so it's no problem. And I never turn down extra money." Press chuckled. "But you know I'd do the extra day for free. That's how much I believe in what we're doing. Your attitude has always been greatly appreciated. I'll email you all the details for the new assignment. We've rebooked you on a later flight, so that's sorted. Again, I apologize for keeping you away from your family. I hope your flight takes off before the big snowstorm hits. They're predicting 15 to 20 inches of snow." After the call, Prez waited for the email to finish downloading before opening it. The email contained details about an intriguing case involving a wife with aspirations of becoming a movie star. Her husband, a highly successful writer for both movies and television, had just completed his final script for a hit TV series that had run for 5 years. Despite the network's desire for him to continue, he had other projects he wished to pursue. Throughout their 5-year marriage, the wife had secretly engaged in multiple affairs with people in the industry whom she believed could advance her career. Now she was involved with one of Hollywood's leading stars, Kirk Southern, who had promised her roles in his next 3 films. Press reviewed the logistics of the project to ensure everything was properly addressed. While it wasn't his direct responsibility, he always took the initiative to do so with any project he was involved in. This particular project had been meticulously planned and executed so far. Next, he checked his emails for updated flight information. He then refocused on the video. Press found men's reactions to ME Inc. S presentations particularly interesting, as was the case with Gary and Jason. However, the most positive response came from the next topic Press covered: DNA testing. This was a major lobbying effort for ME Inc., aimed at advocating for legislation in each state that would mandate DNA testing for all newborns. Since very few fathers have their children's DNA tested at birth, the proposed legislation would not only establish paternity, but could also potentially uncover health issues in newborns. The challenge with establishing paternity for men was that if it wasn't resolved within a relatively short time frame, the father could end up financially supporting children who weren't his. In many states, the courts had determined that men had only a brief period to disprove paternity. After this window, men could be obligated to support the children, even if they knew and could prove who the biological fathers were. There was no certainty that the courts would compel the actual fathers to provide support. If passed, new legislation would allow men to cease payments for children proven not to be theirs at any time. Currently, this situation unfairly penalized innocent husbands while rewarding unfaithful wives. Press continued to monitor his presentation on the tablet, marking off each topic as it was covered. He paused the video at a particular section he hadn't considered during his first marriage: the issue of wives withholding intimacy. His first wife desired intimacy frequently and wasn't selective about her partners. While financial disagreements remained the primary cause of marital discord, intimacy was also a significant issue. Recent laws had changed over the past 30 or 40 years to prevent husbands from forcing their wives into intimacy. Press supported this change, but questioned the purpose of marriage under these conditions. He found the idea of a husband wanting intimacy and being rejected for no valid reason deeply humiliating. To address this issue, ME Inc. advised that men should insist on a prenuptial agreement. It was strongly recommended that this agreement be signed before marriage, regardless of asset ownership. Beyond outlining asset division in the event of a divorce, the agreement should include a clause penalizing either spouse for proven infidelity. Instead of a 50-50 split, the non-cheating spouse would receive 70% of the assets. Additionally, the agreement should specify that at least 1 day a week be designated for intimacy, eliminating concerns about rejection. It would also include a penalty clause stipulating that refusal to comply could lead to divorce, with an 80-20 division of assets, where the non-compliant spouse would receive only 20% of the assets. Despite some minor concerns about certain aspects of ME Inc.'s philosophy, Press fully supported the organization. He had been a pro bono case himself when his unfaithful first wife attempted to take everything from him. Without their assistance, Press knew his circumstances would have been even worse than Ben's. The next morning, Press was up early, as he had scheduled a breakfast meeting with a rare assignment. Today he was meeting with Janet Arnold. Yes, he was going to meet with a woman. This was not a frequent occurrence, but when the situation called for it, ME Inc. was prepared to act. Press spotted Janet sitting in one of the back booths. Her 2 children were on the bench next to her. The boy, about 7, was by the window, and the girl, about 5, was beside their mother. Both had sandy-colored hair and were coloring their placemats with crayons. They wore mismatched clothing to protect themselves from the cold. For now, they seemed content, but occasionally glanced at their mother to make sure she was still there. Janet had dirty blonde hair, which she had attempted to brush into some order. She wore no makeup and appeared exhausted. Press could tell that Janet must have been quite attractive once, but now she was slightly overweight, and her eyes looked dull. Even from across the room he could see that Mrs. Arnold was at least 6 months pregnant. However, Press took comfort in knowing he was about to alleviate some of her hardships. When Press was first assigned a case like this, he was completely surprised and questioned why he was helping a woman, thinking, "Me Inc." S' mission was solely to assist men. Mr. Wagner, a senior vice president, overheard the question and quickly corrected the new field representative. "Mr. Fulton," he said sharply, "I suggest you revisit your training manual. We are aiming for true gender equality, not the one-sided policies pushed by feminists. While we mainly assist men if one of our members is unfaithful to their spouse, we will help the woman if we are able." The longer Press was with the organization, the more he grew to value ME Inc. Unlike others that sought to reinstate outdated practices where women were nearly considered property of their husbands, ME Inc. aimed for equitable laws that didn't favor one gender over the other. The organization sought to uphold the sanctity of marriage and to hold as many cheaters accountable as possible. They believed that if those who cheated understood the severe consequences, they might reconsider before engaging in an affair. "Mrs. Arnold, thank you for meeting with me," Press said as he slid into the booth across from her. "I hope you don't mind, Mr. Fulton," she said nervously, glancing at her children, "but my mother couldn't babysit." "Not at all," he replied with a smile, turning to the 2 children. "I hope you're hungry because I hear the pancakes here are fantastic. They come with whipped cream and sprinkles." The mention of food caught the children's attention immediately. Prez felt a pang of empathy seeing their hunger. The thought of his own children being hungry was heartbreaking. "You don't need to do that, Mr. Fulton," Janet said. "You mentioned you found a small account of my husband's and knew how I could access the funds. Since Tad left us, money has been tight. If you tell me how to access it, we'll be on our way." "Don't worry about it," Press said, signaling for the waitress. "Actually, I have quite a bit to discuss with you, and I'd like to speak about some of it privately. But for now, let's order breakfast. I'll share what's appropriate for the kids to hear." Although Janet was reluctant to impose, Press was insistent. Eventually, swayed by her children's hopeful expressions, she agreed. With Janet's approval, Press ordered pancakes with whipped cream and sprinkles for the kids, along with bacon, hash browns, and chocolate milk. Janet chose scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, while Press opted for a Western omelet and coffee. After the coffee and chocolate milk were served, Janet introduced her 2 children, the boy named Michael and his sister Terry, short for Teresa. They were 7 and 5 years old, respectively. Janet briefly explained that her husband Simon had left her for his secretary, Tammy, abandoning a pile of bills, the children, and no money. Simon had disappeared, and Janet had no idea of his whereabouts. When the food arrived and the children focused on their pancakes, Press began, "I assume you were aware that your husband had been married before?" Janet nodded. "He told me his first wife was a witch who tried to take him for everything he had." "Exactly," Prez said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "They were married for only 2 years, but his first wife, Mary, managed to get all of his passwords and steal all of his money. She even planted prohibited substances in his car and house. Without our intervention, Simon would have faced years in prison." "I don't understand," Janet said, setting her fork down. "Who are you representing and how did you help Simon?" Think of us as an insurance company, Press explained. Your husband bought a policy to protect himself from being cheated. Mary wasn't as clever as she thought. She left a fingerprint on a bag of prohibited substances. We also had her supplier arrested, who then implicated her. Additionally, we traced Simon's stolen money and managed to get it restored. This explanation seemed to satisfy Janet, and she resumed eating. When I first called you, Prez continued, opening his folder, I had just started my investigation. Normally, I wouldn't contact you so quickly, but I knew you were in urgent need of money. Since our last conversation, I've located significantly more of your husband's assets. Did you know he was quite well off? Janet shook her head. Tad managed all the finances. I took care of the children and the house. So far, I've determined that he took about $2 million in liquid assets, Press said. He also has interests in 3 businesses as a silent partner, earning around $100,000 a year from them. Mrs. Arnold, there's a strong case that you're entitled to half of your husband's share in those partnerships. Janet leaned back in her seat, stunned, with her mouth agape. After a moment of reflection, she leaned forward, her eyes filled with profound sadness, and said, That might be true, but I can't afford to fight my husband. I can't even hire a divorce lawyer, so I haven't been able to take any action. Mrs. Arnold, you don't need to worry about that anymore, Press reassured her, gently patting her hand. We've arranged for an excellent attorney to take on your case. He'll be reaching out to you later today. As for the payment, we have a court order stating that your husband will cover the legal fees. Additionally, we've tracked him down. He went to Costa Rica with his girlfriend, but he has been served with divorce papers and is currently in custody, awaiting extradition. His assets have been frozen, except for a modest amount, as ordered by the court, to be allocated for you and Tad's living expenses. Mrs. Arnold's tears started flowing and she began to tremble slightly. This isn't some cruel joke, is it? I assure you everything I've told you is true. I have all the supporting documents in this envelope for you to review later. Before you leave, I'll give you access to the first account, so you can either transfer the funds or withdraw them as needed. But for now, I'd like to discuss something with you privately. Would you mind moving to that empty table over there? You'll still be able to keep an eye on your children, but they won't overhear our conversation. Janet gave Prez a puzzled look, but moved to the next table after instructing her kids to behave. They remained engrossed in their pancakes and chocolate milk. Once Janet was seated, Prez began addressing the sensitive issue. It turns out your husband isn't a very nice person, but I imagine you've already realized that. I'm not sure when he became the creep he is now, but he's made a serious mistake. Our insurance policies include a clause outlining penalties if he breaks any of the rules. Not cheating on your wife is the very first rule. Janet looked puzzled. Penalties? What kind of penalties? I don't understand. Most of the wealth your husband accumulates after you receive your fair share will be used to pay fines to ME Inc. He won't be destitute, but his lifestyle will be significantly downgraded once he's out of prison. Prison? Janet exclaimed louder than intended. What's he going to prison for? He'll be convicted of tax evasion and currency violations. I can't say exactly how much time he'll serve, but I'm confident he'll spend at least 6 months in jail. And as for his secretary, Tammy, though I doubt you care much about her, she's currently stranded in Costa Rica with no money. From my research, she appears to be nothing more than a gold digger. She'll have a tough time getting back to the U.S. since Tad put their passports in a safe deposit box, and Tammy doesn't have access. A smile spread across Janet's face, and then she started to laugh. After having Janet sign several legal documents, Prez said as he stood up, I need to get going. But before putting on his winter coat, He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "There's $500 in here. I want you and the kids to get some decent winter clothes and then enjoy your life." After saying goodbye to the kids, Janet kissed him on the cheek. "I really don't understand what's happening, but thank you from the bottom of my heart." Press paid the bill on his way out and headed for Akron, where the additional project was set to come together. The next day, Press arrived at the conference room at Moreland, Connor and Stiles, the law firm representing Beverly Bracken in her divorce. Gloria Connor was handling the filing and negotiations. This firm was known for its high success rate and particularly tough stance in divorce cases. However, today was poised to be a historic defeat for them. Paul Bracken was represented by Elliot Chalmers, a rather unremarkable middle-aged man who looked more like a struggling British bureaucrat than a lawyer. Paul, Elliot, and Press took seats on one side of the table, with Paul positioned between the two men. Across from them sat Mrs. Bracken, Gloria Connor, 4 legal aides, a court stenographer, and a secretary, who was just placing her notary seal. Press observed both Paul and Beverly. Paul was more attractive than average, with black hair and a charming demeanor. He had entertained Press and Elliot with tales of his Hollywood experiences. Beverly, on the other hand, was strikingly beautiful with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a stunning figure. However, beyond the initial impression, there was something unsettling about her. Perhaps her smile, which never quite reached her eyes, made her seem less genuine. Nevertheless, Beverly's beauty was undeniable, and it was clear why Paul had married her. "Before we begin," Prez announced, standing up and placing his camera bag on the table, "I'd like to set up my camera to record this meeting." "That's not going to be possible," Gloria replied, waving her hand. "We don't allow filming in our offices unless it's a court-sanctioned deposition. So you'll have to put your camera away." Press glanced at Elliot, who immediately responded, "If we can't record this proceeding, we're leaving, and the deal we negotiated will be off. We'll need to start over." "You can't do that," Beverly said, clearly distressed. At that moment, Kirk Southern popped his head in, nodded to everyone, and looked at Beverly. "Just wanted to let you know I'm here." Press noticed the women in the room, including Gloria, had dreamy looks on their faces. He chuckled to himself. Beverly gave a pleading look to Gloria, who finally relented with a nod. "All right, Mr. Fulton, you can set up your camera," Gloria said, clearly irritated. "I suppose we can make an exception." As soon as the camera was installed and recording began, they began discussing the details of the divorce. The house was to be sold, and the proceeds divided equally. However, Press knew that due to the current state of the real estate market, funds were minimal. The funds also had to be divided 50-50, although there was not much to divide, since Paul was mainly focused on writing scripts, and they lived on royalties from his last TV series. Paul agreed to transfer Beverly's fees instead of paying alimony. "Beverly, I just want to clarify," Paul interjected, addressing Gloria. "You will receive royalties for the TV series The Gobbler Twins. Since I transfer all rights to this to you, you waive any claim to my stamp collection or comic books. In addition, you waive any rights to my current or future works." "I don't care about your stupid comics," Beverly retorted scornfully. "I'm getting everything I need anyway." They also had to resolve the issue of alimony payments for Sarah Bracken, who was almost a year old. Gloria objected to the clause stating that Paul would pay $1,500 a month for all the children he and Beverly would have. "I would prefer that Sarah's name be specified specifically," Gloria insisted. "Look," Paul said angrily, "I don't want to have anything to do with this woman who's about to become my ex-wife anymore. She'll sleep with anyone. I know it's true because Beverly slept with me right before she handed me the divorce papers. As far as I know, she may be pregnant right now. I don't want to return to this issue. The agreement remains in force unless you want to renegotiate the terms. Mr. Bracken, I will not tolerate this kind of profanity, Gloria said, blushing with anger. I believe that the wording in this agreement needs to be revised. I'll accept the wording as it is, Beverly said immediately. Despite Gloria's attempts to change her mind, it was clear that Beverly wanted the divorce finalized. They considered the last point, and both Paul and Beverly signed the document. Then the witnesses signed, and the notary sealed them. One copy was given to Beverly, the other to Paul, and each lawyer kept a copy. Is everything settled? Paul asked. When everyone nodded, he stood up and loudly announced, Thank God it's over and I'm not married to her anymore. Both Beverly and Gloria were outraged by this expression, but Gloria spoke first. I have already told you that I will not tolerate such expressions. You should leave before I order the guard to get you out of here. Before Paul could answer, the door opened and Kirk came in. Beverly walked around the table, kissed him, and then wrapped her arms around his waist, grinning at her ex-husband. To the surprise of everyone in the room, Kirk extended his hand to Paul. Hey, Paul, how's it going? I'm doing great, Kirk, Paul said, shaking the movie star's hand. I'm no longer married to that cheating woman who had her arm around you. I heard that's what people said about her in Hollywood, but I didn't believe it, Kirk replied, removing Beverly's arm from his waist and taking her hand. But it seems you were right. Still, I won the bet. Yeah, you did, Paul laughed, but it was worth it. What are you two talking about? Beverly asked, confused. Do you know each other? Kirk smiled down at her and released her hand. I've known Paul since college. What's this about a bet? Paul and Kirk laughed together, leaving Gloria and her associates just as puzzled as Beverly. Well, Beverly dear, Paul said with a smirk, I bet Kirk that he couldn't seduce my loyal, loving wife. I lost. But Kirk, you said you loved me, Beverly said, tears welling up in her eyes. You said you were going to marry me as soon as I was divorced. Beverly, when you married Paul, you promised to forsake all others, Kirk said, shaking his head with a smirk. When I found out about all the other men you were with after marrying Paul, that was a deal-breaker. At this, Beverly broke into sobs. It took Gloria 5 minutes to calm her down. Once Beverly was somewhat composed, Paul sat beside her. Beverly, I may be a bit slow, but I truly believed you loved me, he said, holding her hand. But I have to admit you were convincing. I didn't find out until about a year ago. I was so angry I wanted to divorce you immediately. But then I thought about Sarah and decided to endure it. However, when I had a DNA test done and discovered she wasn't mine, I realized you needed to be taught a lesson. Beverly turned pale at the mention of the DNA test. That's why you insisted on that language, Gloria said through gritted teeth. You set us up. This whole thing was a sham. It was meant to defraud my client. I'm going to have the entire divorce petition thrown out. Good luck with that, counselor, Elliot said with a tight smile. My client hasn't attempted to defraud anyone. According to your client, she got everything she wanted. If there's been any fraud, it's been by your client, trying to pass off her child as Mr. Bracken's. If you think you've got a case, go ahead. As for me, I'm quite happy with the evidence we have on camera. There was silence in the room, broken only by Beverly's sobs. Then Paul spoke up. Beverly, look at me. His future ex-wife looked up. Paul sighed. I'll be honest with you. I thought that by taking revenge on you and humiliating you, I would get at least some satisfaction. This did not happen. I loved you with all my heart, and even after I found out about your betrayal, a part of me still cared about you. Kirk is right about your reputation. Every producer and director knows that you will do anything to get a role. It seems I was the only one who didn't know about your true nature." It was clear that Paul still had feelings for Beverly. "Do you remember the day you got a role in my TV series, The Gobbler Twins?" Beverly nodded. "I was so excited that all my hard work had finally paid off. You didn't lift a finger to help me." "That's where you're wrong," Paul said, shaking his head. "It's true that I told you to handle it yourself, but watching your efforts and constant failures, I still intervened. I never told you that I stood up for you to get this role." "You're lying," Beverly snapped. "I earned this role myself." "That's what I wanted you to think. The truth is, I had to make a deal with the studio to get you this role. I had to agree to limit the number of years during which I would receive royalties. That's why they will end in about 2.5 years." Beverly's face turned to one of shock, and Gloria's complexion flushed a deep red as she suddenly realized her oversight. She had only verified that the royalties were being paid without further investigation. Gloria felt a profound sense of humiliation, but it was nothing compared to Beverly's anguish. The pride she had felt was tied to her husband's sacrifice, and this realization brought her to tears once more. Paul addressed her gently. "I want you to know that I won't abandon Sarah. While she's not my daughter, I do have feelings for her. I've instructed Mr. Chalmers to set up a trust for her, which I've initially funded with $200,000. My plan is to increase this amount to $500,000, if possible. The interest from this trust will be used for Sarah's care. Beverly, you will not have control over this money. You will only be allowed to submit verified bills for Sarah's expenses. When Sarah turns 25, the trust will be handed over to her. I advise you to save the earnings from the series, as you will need them. Frankly, Beverly, you're not a very good actress. With your reputation, you might land minor roles until your looks fade. I would recommend a different career path, but if you're willing to compromise your integrity for roles, that's up to you." Beverly's face twisted with pure hatred, clearly struck by Paul's words. Despite her anger, she remained silent and turned to Kirk for solace. Paul sighed deeply and shook his head in disappointment. "Beverly, I doubt you've ever truly loved anyone other than yourself. I hope you find love someday and aren't betrayed as I was." He looked from Kirk back to Beverly. "But if today is when you're going to experience pain, you have my sympathy." Paul slowly stood up. "This is the last time we will speak. If you need to reach me, do so through Elliot. Take good care of Sarah, or you will face severe consequences." He surveyed the room, shook hands with Elliot and Prez, and patted Kirk on the shoulder before they left together. Beverly rested her head on the table, sobbing uncontrollably. Prez quickly gathered his belongings, retrieved his car, and headed to the airport, catching the last flight out before it was closed due to the approaching blizzard. 1 year later, Preston Turner sat in a chair across from his supervisor, James Baker, for his annual performance review. Press knew that while his cases were periodically reviewed after submission, the annual review focused on cases he believed should be closed. Today, Press hoped to get approval to close 3 cases from Cleveland and 1 from Akron. After receiving high praise during his review, the 2 men shifted their focus to the cases in question to decide if they should be closed. Go over that project with Gary and Jason. Explain why you think they should be closed. Mr. Baker directed President Gary Harris and Jason Witten. Press read from his folder. In case you don't recall, both men were set to marry soon, but we discovered Gary's fiancée was a serial cheater. Gary humiliated Belinda at the church service and has moved on. Yes, I remember that video, Mr. Baker acknowledged. I almost felt sorry for her. It seemed she did care for Gary, but how is she doing now? After her infidelities were revealed, Belinda left Cleveland and ended up in Las Vegas, where she works as a cocktail waitress and part-time dealer. She still has contact with her mother, but her father refuses to speak to her. Since the failed wedding, Belinda has continued to see multiple men. She seems incapable of being faithful, yet she still has feelings for Gary and writes to him occasionally. Gary, while forgiving her enough to respond to her letters sometimes, has no intention of reconciling. He's currently in a serious relationship with Linda Chaucer and is expected to propose within the next 2 months. And what about the best man? How was he handled? We didn't need to intervene. The district attorney dismissed him, and the bar suspended his license for 5 years. He lost all his friends and moved out of town shortly after the wedding incident. And Belinda's boss? His wife took him to court in the divorce. He's not destitute, but he lost half of everything, and his 3 children no longer speak to him. What about Jason Witten? He married his fiancée, Melissa, and they seem very happy. Melissa agreed to the prenuptial agreement without any issues. They are also expecting their first child soon. Mr. Baker smiled. I approve the closure of both of those cases. Now tell me about Ben Sharpen's case. As we hoped, Ben was able to sue and recover the child support payments he had made from the biological fathers. But Ben achieved more than just reclaiming the support money. We located the funds that his ex-wife had concealed overseas from her prohibited substances activities. After subtracting the alimony Ben had paid her and an additional $300,000 for his pain and suffering, we informed the IRS of the remaining funds' location. The lawsuits against the law firm and the financial institution were quite successful. After covering the legal fees, Ben ended up with nearly $2 million. The 3 biological fathers were all divorced by their wives. The 2 attorneys had their wives sign prenuptial agreements, but those were invalidated because the husbands failed to have separate legal representation for their wives. All 3 attorneys faced significant losses in their divorces. As for Ben, he left the Cleveland clinic and established several of his own medical clinics. He also has a girlfriend, Linda Crawford, who was previously a nurse at the Cleveland clinic and now works for Ben at one of his clinics. Additionally, Ben joined a gym and has lost 40 pounds so far. What about his ex-wife and her children? Mr. Baker asked. Mrs. Sharpen was convicted on multiple charges, including prohibited substances trafficking and tax evasion. It was proven that the heroin she sold caused a teenager's death. She received a sentence of 20 years to life. Her children were sentenced to 5 to 7 years in prison. Her last 4 partners also received jail terms, but I didn't inquire about their lengths as they weren't part of this case. Excellent work. I approve the closure of this case as well. Janet Arnold's case has been particularly gratifying for me. Pries continued without prompting. I'm especially pleased with the outcome. Mrs. Arnold and her children were so thoroughly wronged by one of our members that it was quite disheartening. I remember this case, Mr. Baker acknowledged. It was discussed extensively in several supervisor meetings. Do you feel it's ready to be closed now? Yes, sir. The final judgments have been issued, and Mrs. Arnold received half of the assets we could locate. Initially, I thought there might be more money hidden elsewhere, but considering Mr. Arnold's financial situation, I'm confident we've uncovered everything. And how is Mr. Arnold doing? After Mrs. Arnold received her share, we paid Mr. Arnold's back taxes with penalties. As you know, we don't pay interest to the government since they can take years to determine additional taxes owed. Due to their inefficiency, we don't believe they're entitled to any interest. Ultimately, Mr. Arnold was left with less than $200,000. Since this amount exceeds the limit one of our members is allowed to keep when violating the covenant, I was prepared to continue working on the case. However, one of his investments collapsed, leaving him with only about $30,000. He's now in the used car business. What about the other 2 partnerships? Even receiving half of his share of the income would exceed the maximum allowed. To cover his share of the losses from the failed partnership, he had to sell his stake in the other 2. However, we managed to secure Mrs. Arnold's claim before he divested. She is now receiving the income she is entitled to. "Oh, one more thing," Press said with a smile as he pulled out a sheet of paper. "It seems there was an issue with the extradition paperwork. Mr. Arnold ended up spending 3 months in a Costa Rican jail. He went in slightly overweight but came out quite thin. The marshals found it amusing because they had never seen anyone so delighted to be sent back to an American prison." "Just out of curiosity," Press's boss asked, "what happened to the woman Mr. Arnold ran away with?" "Ah, Tammy," Press smiled. "It took her nearly 2 months to return to the United States. After enduring near poverty in Costa Rica, she likely has a newfound appreciation for America. Her previous behavior made it difficult for her to find a new job, but she eventually landed a position as an administrative assistant. As far as I can tell, she hasn't returned to her previous gold-digging ways. However, she will be monitored, and if she does revert to that behavior, especially with one of our members, we will take action." "I want to err on the side of caution," Mr. Baker said, examining the report. "Perhaps we'll keep this case open a bit longer to monitor Tammy's actions and check if Mr. Arnold has any hidden assets. Now, regarding the last case, Mr. Paul Bracken, I know what happened, but I'd like you to go over the results. The divorce was contested, but the courts dismissed the challenges. Mr. Bracken is now producing a new television series titled Runaway Husbands. He negotiated a deal where he owns the series, which has been a top 10 hit since its debut and has already been renewed for 2 years. Interestingly, I think the role of the narrator would have been ideal for Paul's ex-wife, Beverly. I suspect he may have written the series with her in mind." "And was Mr. Southern able to extricate himself from Beverly's influence?" Mr. Baker chuckled. "Their relationship ended that day, and I believe Mr. Bracken was right when he predicted that Beverly would eventually fall in love and possibly face betrayal. From what I've seen, Beverly genuinely loved Kirk and was devastated when he left her. She didn't date anyone for 6 months afterward and has only been dating occasionally since. Beverly is now a real estate agent, and as far as we know, she isn't involved with anyone at the moment. Most of her free time is spent with her daughter, Sarah, and she has proven to be a much better mother than I initially thought. She also occasionally performs in the local community theater. This wasn't exactly your project, but since you're here, I thought I'd review it with you. I'm ready to close it based on the results." With the review finished, Prez started to rise. "If there's nothing else, I'll get back to work. Actually, there is one more thing I want to discuss with you." Mr. Baker gestured for Press to sit back down. "What's that, sir?" "As you know, we recently surpassed 2 million members, and our growth is outpacing expectations. We need more field representatives and urgently require qualified regional supervisors. I received the approval this morning, and you're being promoted to one of those supervisory roles. Congratulations." Prez was taken aback but managed to thank Mr. Baker. "You've earned it, Press. Your work has been outstanding. You'll start on Monday. However, I should warn you that 3 or 4 of the projects your new team is handling are currently underperforming. I'm confident you'll be able to turn them around. Good luck." The 2 men shook hands and Press left the office with a smile.